The photograph arrived at the Virginia Museum of History in a cedar box, wrapped in silk that had yellowed with age. Dr. Sarah Chen, the museum's lead curator for Civil War collections, lifted it carefully from its protective casing. The daguerreotype was remarkably well preserved, its silver surface still reflecting light after more than a century and a half. 5 people stared back at her from 1860. A prosperous white family, clearly wealthy, judging by their clothing and the elaborate studio setting. The patriarch sat in the center, a stern-faced man in his 50s with a thick beard and dark suit. His wife stood beside him, one hand resting on his shoulder, her dress an elaborate creation of silk and lace. 3 young men, presumably their sons, completed the composition, 2 standing behind their parents, 1 seated to the father's left. Sarah had examined thousands of antebellum photographs. This one followed all the conventions, formal poses, serious expressions, the careful arrangement of bodies to demonstrate family hierarchy and respectability. The photographer had written on the back in faded ink, "The Harrison family, Richmond, Virginia, March 1860." March 1860. Sarah felt a chill. That date placed the photograph just 1 year before the Civil War began, in the heart of what would become the Confederate capital. Richmond had been a center of slave trade, a city where fortunes were built on the buying and selling of human beings. She set the daguerreotype on her examination table and adjusted the magnifying lamp. The donor's note had said the photograph came from an estate sale, part of a collection belonging to descendants who'd moved north decades ago. No other information had been provided. Sarah began her standard analysis, noting details that would help with historical context. The father's clothing suggested merchant-class wealth, expensive but not aristocratic. The mother's jewelry was tasteful, valuable. The sons, ranging from perhaps 18 to 30 years old, wore matching dark suits that indicated family unity and prosperity. Then she noticed the hands. In formal Victorian photography, hand placement was carefully choreographed. Hands rested on furniture, clasped together or hung naturally at sides, but something about this family's hands seemed odd. Sarah leaned closer, adjusting the magnification. The father's right hand, resting on the arm of his chair, had fingers positioned in an unusual configuration. His index and middle fingers crossed, while his thumb extended outward. The mother's hand on his shoulder mirrored a similar strange gesture. Each of the 3 sons had their hands positioned differently, but all seemed deliberately posed in ways that violated typical photographic conventions. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. She'd seen hand positions like these before, not in photographs, but in historical documents about coded communication systems. She grabbed her phone and pulled up her research files, scrolling through images of abolitionist signals and Underground Railroad codes. Sarah's hands trembled as she compared the photograph to her reference materials. The father's crossed fingers. That was a known abolitionist signal meaning safe passage. The mother's gesture, thumb and pinky extended while other fingers curled. That indicated shelter available. Each son's hand position corresponded to different coded messages she'd seen documented in Underground Railroad communications, but this made no sense. Richmond, Virginia, in 1860, was slave territory, a city where abolitionist sympathies could get you killed. Why would a wealthy white family in the Confederate capital pose for a photograph displaying Underground Railroad codes? Sarah pulled up the donor information again. The estate sale had been held in Philadelphia, the photographs discovered in the attic of a house that had belonged to Harrison descendants. She found a phone number and called immediately. An elderly woman answered. "Hello? Mrs. Patterson? This is Dr. Sarah Chen from the Virginia Museum of History. I'm calling about the photographs your family donated, specifically the Harrison family portrait from 1860. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Patterson said. "My great-great-grandfather's family. I'm afraid I don't know much about them. They left Virginia during the war and never went back." "Do you know why they left?" There was a pause. Family stories say they weren't welcome in Richmond anymore, something about their sympathies being unpopular. But the details were never discussed. My grandmother said there were things about the family that were better left buried. Sarah felt electricity run through her. "Mrs. Patterson, did anyone in your family ever mention Underground Railroad activities?" The silence stretched longer this time. Finally, Mrs. Patterson spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know?" "The photograph," Sarah said. "Their hands. Each person is making coded signals used by abolitionists. This wasn't just a family portrait. It was a message." Mrs. Patterson's breath caught. "My grandmother told me once, when she was very old and her memory was failing, that our ancestors had been conductors. I thought she was confused, talking about railroad workers, but she said they conducted souls to freedom and it cost them everything. I never understood what she meant." Sarah explained what she'd discovered, describing each hand signal and its meaning. As she spoke, she could hear Mrs. Patterson crying softly. "All these years," the elderly woman said, I thought we came from Confederate sympathizers. My whole life, I've carried shame about my Virginia roots, assuming my ancestors had been on the wrong side of history. And now you're telling me they were heroes? If I'm right about this, yes, Sarah said carefully, but I need to verify it. Do you have any other family documents, letters, diaries, business records? There's a trunk, Mrs. Patterson said, in my basement, full of old papers I've never gone through. My mother said they were too fragile, told me to leave them alone. Would those help? They might contain everything we need, Sarah said. Would you be willing to let me examine them? 2 days later, Sarah stood in Mrs. Patterson's basement in a quiet Philadelphia suburb, staring at a leather-bound trunk that hadn't been opened in decades. The old woman hovered nearby, her weathered hands clasped together nervously. I haven't looked inside since I was a child, Mrs. Patterson said. My mother caught me trying to open it once and got so upset. She said the past should stay buried, that some family secrets were too dangerous to dig up. I never understood what she meant. Sarah carefully lifted the trunk's lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of documents, letters tied with ribbon, ledgers, journals, and loose papers. She pulled out the first bundle gently, aware that the paper might disintegrate if handled roughly. The top letter was dated April 1859, written in elegant script. Sarah read aloud, My dearest brother, I write to inform you that our mutual friend's merchandise arrived safely. 23 pieces in total, all in acceptable condition despite the difficult journey. They have been temporarily housed and will continue north as arranged. Please send word when the next shipment is expected. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. Merchandise? What does that mean? It's code, Sarah explained. Underground Railroad operators used business language to disguise their activities. Merchandise, or packages, meant escaped slaves. Housed meant hidden in safe houses. This letter is describing the successful transport of 23 escaped slaves through Richmond. The elderly woman's eyes widened. Through Richmond? But that was the heart of slave territory. Exactly, which made it brilliant. Who would suspect a wealthy merchant family in the Confederate capital of running an underground railroad station? Sarah continued reading through the letters, finding message after coded message describing rescue operations, safe house locations, and coordination with other conductors. One letter from October 1859 was more explicit. Father grows increasingly concerned about discovery. The neighbors question why our warehouse receives shipments at odd hours. Thomas suggested we reduce operations, but Mother insists we cannot abandon our principles simply because the risk has grown. She says each soul we save justifies whatever consequences we might face. Sarah looked up at Mrs. Patterson. Thomas, would that be one of the sons in the photograph? Thomas Harrison was my great-great-grandfather, Mrs. Patterson confirmed. He moved to Philadelphia in 1861 and never returned to Virginia. The family story was that he'd had a falling out with his parents, but no one ever explained why. Sarah pulled out a journal next, its leather cover cracked with age. The first entry was dated January 1858, written in the same hand as the photograph's label, presumably the patriarch, the father in the family portrait. She read the opening passage. I have decided to keep this record, though I know the danger it represents. If discovered, these words could condemn my entire family. But I believe history must know what we attempted, whether we succeed or fail. We are 5 people, myself, my beloved wife Catherine, and our 3 sons, and we have pledged ourselves to a cause that makes us traitors to our neighbors and criminals under the law. We will use our textile business as cover to transport escaped slaves through Richmond and north to freedom. Sarah spent the next 6 hours carefully documenting the journal entries, her hands cramping from typing on her laptop as she transcribed the father's detailed accounts. The Harrison family's operation had been extraordinarily sophisticated and breathtakingly dangerous. The father, whose name was revealed as Robert Harrison, owned a textile import business with warehouses near Richmond's docks. He received shipments of fabric from northern states and distributed them throughout Virginia. The business provided perfect cover. Large wagons arriving and departing at all hours, warehouses with hidden storage spaces, regular travel routes that connected to other cities. But Robert hadn't started out as an abolitionist. His journal revealed a gradual awakening that began in 1856, when he witnessed a slave auction that turned his stomach. I watched a mother torn from her children, sold to separate owners who dragged them in different directions while she screamed. Her anguish was inhuman, or rather too human. In that moment, I understood that what we call property are people who feel and suffer as deeply as my own beloved family. I returned home and could not meet my wife's eyes. How could I claim to be a moral man while benefiting from a system built on such cruelty? Catherine Harrison, his wife, had apparently shared his revulsion. Together, they'd made contact with Quaker abolitionists in Philadelphia, who connected them to the Underground Railroad network. The challenge was logistics. Richmond was deep in slave territory, far from the free states. Moving escaped slaves through the city required an elaborate system of concealment and misdirection. Robert's journal described how they'd modified their warehouse, creating false walls and hidden compartments in their shipping crates. Escaped slaves would be smuggled into Richmond from surrounding plantations, hidden in the warehouse for a few days, then transported north in fabric shipments. The shipments went to business contacts in Pennsylvania, who were also part of the network. Our three sons have each taken on specific roles, Robert wrote in March 1858. Thomas, our eldest at 28, manages the warehouse operations and coordinates with our northern contacts. He has proven remarkably steady under pressure. James, 24, serves as our lookout and messenger, moving through the city, gathering intelligence about slave catchers and suspicious officials. And William, just 19, has taken the most dangerous role. He travels to plantations, posing as a fabric buyer, making contact with enslaved people and arranging their escapes. Sarah paused at that entry, stunned by the scale of risk. William would have been younger than most of her graduate students, traveling alone into plantations where slave owners held absolute power, arranging escapes that could get him hanged if discovered. She found a later entry from June 1859 that made her blood run cold. William returned from a buying trip with bruises and a split lip. He'd been questioned by a plantation overseer who suspected his true purpose. William maintained his cover story barely. He told me tonight that he fears he's being watched. I have advised him to suspend his activities, but he refuses. Every week I wait, he said, is another week those people suffer in chains. I won't stop because I'm scared. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been reading over Sarah's shoulder, wiped